Tov, everybody. Good morning. It's nice to see you all bright and early. I'll give you a few pointers. Maybe some of you were here last night. It was a big presentation on a lot of the issues. Of course, one can talk about the Jewish community in Argentina for a whole week because it's a pretty long history, also a large Jewish community, but a community that also has seen a lot of anti-Semitism on the one hand, but on the other hand, a community that prospered and found a home in this country and expanded and contributed to the life of that country, not only within the Jewish community, but in the vaster, wider sense of the word. So the exhibit is, as I mentioned last night, is compact. It's one room, but it has, I think Molly and her staff did a wonderful job in bringing together and explaining the crucial aspects of that jury. Not the details, but the broad painting, in a way, of some of the incidents, some of the developments, some of the issues that make this jury distinct from all others. There's this element of the Jewish gauchos, the Jewish cowboys of the Pampas. And it wasn't just one family or 10 families. There were tens of thousands of Jews that eventually, through the Jewish Colonization Association, made their way to the Argentine Pampas and established themselves in agricultural colonies. These colonies, and we have a whole window there at the exhibit, in celebration of the centennial of the life of the Jewish colonies in Argentina, in the hinterland. It's not in the big city, in the hinterland. And you see Jews dressed as gauchos and riding their horses. They look just a regular gaucho. And at the beginning they spoke Yiddish and then turned to Spanish. They built not only nicer homes as they prospered, but also built synagogues and centers, cultural centers. The Yiddish theater that was rampant in Buenos Aires also came to some of the colonies on occasion for a few days. They established enormous libraries. These were Jews. Jews read, right? They buy books, they read them. The libraries were mainly Yiddish at the beginning, but then Spanish and so on. This was an episode that lasted for many, many generations. However, today, 130 years after the beginning of that process, most of the people have left, their descendants have left the farms. Those who retain them are doing very well because the value has gone up. It's in the Jewish blood, so to speak, to have intellectual ambitions. So, as the children or grandchildren of the original pioneers came of age, they moved to the bigger cities. And the attraction of Buenos Aires, a first-rate city in the world, with the culture and the universities and everything else, was very attractive. So people left the colonies, but the heritage was there. They took that with them. And those who grew up in these colonies were very Jewish, because there it's like living in Israel in a way. Everybody was Jewish. Moses lived in the town next to the farm was a Jewish town. The mayor was Jewish, the policeman was Jewish. You know, there were some non-Jews too, but the majority were Jewish. So the culture, the air was very, very rich in the Jewish heritage. So that is a major distinction. There's no other Jewry that has this at the level that Argentina has it. There were, as I like to say in all my presentations, and the subtitle of the exhibit points out, it's inclusion and exclusion. The Jews were welcomed, and it was a haven for those who came from Europe or from the Middle East, the Sephardic communities. They came, as most immigrants came to the States, with very little, and eventually prospered. But as Jews, we don't really mind to say, well, we didn't come from money, but eventually we prospered. Some people like to say, oh, we were wealthy in a little shtetl in Eastern Europe. No, not really. Some were. You know, the first ones to leave were the poorest. It's a fact. You know, those who had something said, well, we can wait it out. We're doing okay. So some waited too long also. So in any case, what Argentine Jewry has in common with U.S. Jewry is that the same type of immigrant went there. They just took different boats or ships. One came to New York or to Galveston or Boston and so on, and others landed in Buenos Aires all the way south. But Argentina was an attractive country for many, many decades. It's only after 1930 that they start with the revolutions, the military takeovers. But up to 1930, it was really a good country to go and attracted Jews. The laws were very advanced in comparison to other countries. I mentioned that in detail last night. You know, the laws of education. Education became universal, free, and secular, which is very important. So a Jew in Eastern Europe who read in the newspapers about the possibility of immigration said, oh, I thought Argentina was a Spanish country with Inquisition killing Jews in autos de fe. You know, this is the image you have. All of a sudden, the image started to change. It's a country with a lot of possibilities, economic as well as the freedoms that one could enjoy. And that's why Argentina became the largest Jewish community after the United States in the Americas. By far, there were more Jews in Argentina than in the rest of the whole of Latin America at one time. Almost 500,000 in 1960 at the top. So, you know, except the United States with its 6 million Jews, you know, we're talking about smaller concentrations of Jews. So the city attracted, the economic possibilities attracted, and for a while the Jews had a say in many aspects. But as immigrants, they had to wait it out. But once the second, third, and fourth generation came into being, the Jews excelled in many other aspects of the life of the country. In politics even. The first Jew to become a member of a cabinet was Mr. Breiter in 1958 or so, around that time. And later on, during democratic periods in which elected administrations were in power, Jews were very visible. we're talking now 60s, 70s, up to our day, when the military take over, no Jew is seen in the political spectrum. And the reasons are obvious. The military adopted views that were not as open as a democratic view of the heritage of the country and the future of the country. Democracies view a country as a country of immigrants, much like this country. And everybody has the right to live. The military see this differently. They see Argentina, for example, as the motto of some of these takeovers was being in need of a civilization that is Western and Christian. So that excludes those who are not Western or who are not Christian. And the Jews are not Western in origin, and of course we're not Christian either. So in the military mind, they wanted to restore the good old times, when everybody was a Christian and so on. There were different anti-Semitic events, some even early on. And in my book I highlight quite a few, but the most important one was what was called the Semana Trágica, the tragic week of January of 1919, almost 100 years ago. And it started in 1919. Most of the Jews were immigrants in those days. There was a younger generation of Jews born in the country, but the vast majority were workers. Some were, many came from Russia. And just think, 1919, that is very close to what? The end of World War I. And what happened towards the end of World War I in Russia? The Russian Revolution.
Right.
So in the minds of a lot of people, and in this country too, we had the Red Scare. I'm sure you heard about that, right? The Red Scare was the fear of communism spreading throughout the world. And just as here, there were people who were very, very apprehensive and opposed to that, and actually saw in every person who came from Russia a red communist. And who was the epitome of a Russian in the streets of Buenos Aires? The Jews. You know, they would call every Jew a Russian. Not a Jew sometimes, just a Russian, even if that person came from Poland or from Austria or whatever. Everybody was a Russian. Just like Sephardic Jews, whether they came from Turkey or from Syria or from Morocco, they were all Turcos, all Turkish. You know? It's just how terms are created or used. It wasn't necessarily a negative term, but it was a collective way of representing the Jews. So nationalist groups in Argentina, during a strike of one of the important enterprises there, the Vasena Brothers, which was a metallurgical enterprise, they employed hundreds of people. There was a strike. And the owners brought in scabs, you know, strike breakers, people to replace them. And there was a clash between the original workers who were striking and the scabs. And of course, the police intervened and the nationalist groups intervened, and it was all hell breaking out. And it went on into different parts of the cities, and these nationalist groups went to the Russian Jewish neighborhoods and started to hit Jews and wound them, and a couple of deaths took place, and so on. So it was a tragic week in Argentine history, but it was more tragic for the particular Jewish community there. But then, during the 20s, the roaring 20s, there are anti-Semitic events here and there, but I would say nothing exceptional. Some people call it the Jew a Jew, or but nothing of really deep roots. The 20s were in Argentina also a period of growth and of peace. The middle-class governments were in power for the first time during that decade. And in the United States, there were quotas, immigration quotas, that started in 1921. They were stricter in 1924, and even stricter 2 years later. So the Jewish quota, or the quota of immigrants from Russia and from Austria, Hungary, and all the areas of great Jewish immigration, Poland, were smaller and smaller in this country. So where to go? And many went to Argentina. Other places in South America too, but basically to Argentina, because you know how it is. Where you have already some immigrants, the next wave will go there because they have relatives, or a landsman, you know, somebody will give you a job, etc. They speak the same language. So Argentina took quite a large number of Jews. Others went to Cuba and Mexico because they were next door to the U.S. in an attempt to later on enter the U.S. But 1930 is the guerrilla groups were of different ideologies. Some were Maoists, some were Trotskyites, some were Leninists, with different tidbits in their ideologies. But they were all leftists. And the military, as they took over with the notion of cleansing the country of all these leftist groups. It was against the nature of the Argentine population. These were foreign ideologies. They sometimes equated them with Judaism, with Masonry, communism. You know, they're all in the same bag in the minds of some of the military people. They wanted to return to a civilization that was Western and Christian. And everybody should behave. Communism we don't like. And it was an all-out war against the leftist guerrillas. And some were powerful. The guerrillas themselves were not fully observant of the law because they were, in some cases, they had this ideology that you have to be a Robin Hood type of person, take from the wealthy and give it to the poor. So they would kidnap big shots and demand high ransoms for their operations. In this same way that other terrorist groups operate of different ideologies. But the military came down on them ruthlessly. In Argentina in those days, there were concentration camps, torture camps, and death camps. This was not known at the time, but it was revealed towards the end of that period. And much has been written about it. About 30,000 disappeared, which is a euphemism for people being murdered, took place in Argentina. 10 to 12% were Jewish. And it's in the Jewish blood to have some type of sentiment for social justice. After all, the prophets teach that. If you open the Torah, you have to do for the widow and for the orphan and for the poor and for the foreigner. You have to give. It's incumbent on the community to uplift everybody who is indigent. The same with the prophets of Israel, Isaiah or Micah or Elijah, etc. So it's in the blood of the Jewish people to help each other and help everybody. So quite a few Jews were involved in these guerrilla groups. The Jewish community went through a difficult period. The established Jewish community, the non-leftist Jewish community, they knew that a lot of people, sometimes sons or daughters of people of prominence in the community, had turned to the guerrillas because of their rebellion. So in any case, worldwide help came from institutions in this country, like the American Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Committee. They helped in saving souls in Argentina from the brutality of the military. And also non-Jews as well. I don't know if I should go into details of that. Maybe it's...
I thought last night when you were talking about the difference between the Carter administration and the Reagan administration,
yes,
that was a pretty interesting...
yes. Thank you. I mentioned last night that I was asked by a group that wanted to research the whole event of the 7 years of the dirty war and the disappearances and how it affected Jewish life. And since I lived in the New York area at the time, they asked me to do some research about how American Jewish institutions intervened. And I was given access to the archives of the ADL, the American Jewish Committee, and others. And eventually I wrote a paper, a very detailed paper on this. From looking at the archives of what they did, and the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, did a fabulous job. They saved hundreds of lives. They put pressure on the junta people through American conduits, through the State Department, through every ways one could go. But there was, the revolt was in 1976 in Argentina. That same year, in 1976, was an election year in this country. And who won the election? Jimmy Carter, Democrat. Ford was trying to be re-elected. Well, he was never elected, but he lost to Carter, mainly because he pardoned Nixon, I think. But Carter was a man who believed in human rights. And after all, there's a lot of criticism about Carter, and I have my views on that too. But a few things you cannot take away from him. Camp David, he made peace between Israel and Egypt, and he was the major instrument. And secondly, in respect to Argentina, he was implacable. He was relentless in trying to restore some type of human dignity there, as much as he could. And he sent emissaries to Argentina, human rights emissaries. The most famous one that went often to Buenos Aires to speak to the generals and to inspect things was Patricia Derian, and others as well. But Carter only lasted for 4 years. by 1980, he lost the election to Ronald Reagan. When Ronald Reagan came into power, he was very lenient on the generals because his main thrust was anti-communism, the Cold War. Eventually he was, in a way, successful in the Cold War because we saw the fall of the Soviet Union towards the end of his tenure. Almost, you know. Anyway, I'm not going to speak about American politics at this time. But he was so soft with the generals in Argentina. In any case, by 1981, 82, as Reagan was comfortable in power, the military in Argentina had done most of their dirty work. They did it swiftly and at the beginning. They had killed a lot of people. They had destroyed the guerrilla movement. Some saw it as a great victory. Others saw it as a disaster. But anyway, different views on that. But that's the point. Jimmy Carter was very, very aware of the lack of human rights. And Ronald Reagan closed an eye for the sake of fighting the Cold War. So that's something you might want to add in explaining that episode. It's the saddest episode in the history of Argentina, that period of 7 years. Interestingly enough, what brought the military down was an economic downturn in Argentina. By 1983, the economy was in shambles. People were losing jobs, and there was the famous parades with their pots and pans making noise in front of the government house. And the military, to distract the attention of the people, invaded the Falkland Islands. Remember that?
Yes.
In Argentina, you called the Falkland Islands Malvinas, the Malvinas Islands. Many decades ago, like every Argentinian student in the public schools, was indoctrinated. These islands are ours. The English held them. Of course, the English had stolen them 100 years before. But the Argentines were reclaiming them constantly, and it was a matter of pride. And they instilled that. I always, it was ingrained in my heart that these are ours. So the military, to distract the public, they took planes, a couple of planes, and invaded. They were not guarded. These Malvinas are windswept islands with a lot more sheep than people. It's a very harsh life, but it was an English bastion there. Not highly populated either. So the country in Argentina, wow, we got the Malvinas back, you know. Mrs. Thatcher was very thankful because she had problems in England. She was going to lose the next election. But then came this little war in the South Atlantic, and the people started to prop her up. And she won that war because they came with all the ships, and the Queen Elizabeth II, and it was transformed into a military ship, the QE2 and many others. And there was a horrible war. Both sides were terrible. Lives, hundreds of lives were lost, and so on. Anyway, they're still English, And the Argentines, every year, they go to the UN and petition that we are still claiming them back. So the charade goes on. But that brought the military down because the Argentines fought in that war, and there were some Jewish soldiers who fought too. They were recruited. And it was a shame how they were very ill prepared, terribly prepared. So they lost face, they called elections, and then democracy ensued. And the interesting thing, and this is something that you might want to highlight, during the military period, you never saw a Jew in politics or of influence. Jews petitioned. If there were disappearances, they petitioned to the authorities, to the Ministry of Interior, to the local police, etc. Everybody did as much as you could. But if you have an Argentine citizenship, who is watching your back? It's the country and the despots. Only people with an American backing, or the Israeli embassy to some extent as well, could exert some pressure and ameliorate the situation at times. Not always successful. But now there's democracy again, and eventually you see Jews elected to both chambers, from both main parties. They are in the cabinet. They are very visible, governors of some of the provinces. Everywhere you see Jews in influence. And as I mentioned last night, the Radical Party, that's the name of the party, it wasn't a radical party, it was a centrist party, very much like the Democratic Party in the US, but it was called radical because it was in opposition to the very conservative parties in the Argentine political spectrum. So they won the election, and people all of a sudden saw so many Jews in power, in positions of influence, that they used to call it, instead of the Radical Party, they called it the Radical Synagogue. Tongue in cheek, but you know, these things happen. And since then, with all the ups and downs of the economy, the Jews are pretty much visible in Argentinian politics. They're very visible in their contribution to the culture of the country. The gentleman just was asking a few questions before this meeting, and I mentioned Daniel Barenboim, the famous pianist and conductor, who is an Argentinian Jew who, with his parents, made Aliyah to Israel, and eventually became a world-famous conductor. For a while, he was the conductor of the Chicago Symphony. Very rebellious type of person, but he was, in the world of music, very much respected. He also is, as one of his pet projects, is to promote an understanding between Jews and Palestinians in Israel. But he never forgot his Argentinian upbringing. He has recordings and even concerts based on tango. Mm-hmm. And he goes periodically back to Argentina for special concerts. And he plays the cultural life that were pioneering in Argentina. They were among the first to introduce cooperativism among the farmers. So it's the principle of the Akshara in Israel, or or even of a kibbutz. You share the machinery, you share the instruments, but you also have a concerted effort to sell your produce in bulk all together. So no one has to handle, to bargain with the big companies that are in Buenos Aires or in London and so on, who buy the grain and try to pay very low prices. So through cooperativism, they could get a decent return for the refuse. Sometimes the farmer doesn't make much. The one who makes the big money is the person who buys from the farms and sells it to the distributor. So these are things that happen in every type of business. But cooperativism was introduced in Argentina by the Jewish farmers, who are very, very largest. They also were the first to introduce the sunflower planting, sunflower, and to derive oil of the sunflower. It's called girasol in Spanish. It's the same concept. It gyrates towards the sun, like the sunflower does. But they were very, very much at the avant-garde in this aspect. Maybe I'll stop here and ask you for some questions.
Well, if it's okay, Victor.
Or we can go upstairs?
We can do that, but if you wouldn't mind, just two other topics that if you just wouldn't mind touching on briefly is kind of just going back to before the Dirty War, touching on the capture of Eichmann.
Yeah.
And also speaking a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, to the bombings in 1990.
Okay. Yeah. Molly's right. We highlight the sad experiences.
Well, unfortunately, those are the things that many people do know
about. It's like the news on your TV screens. It's always the bad news. The good news, nobody talks about. But I think I want to remind you as you guide people looking at the exhibition that there were many fight points in the life of the Jewish community. The sad points are there in the pictures, in the documents, but in between there was a life, and a very rich life, up to this day. Yes, 1960 was the time of the capture of Eichmann, and when people say, and this I do say with authority because of my research. I was watching films, old films in the 1940s. Not that I was watching them then, but now, later on. The war was still going on, and American films talked about things to do with the war, and all of a sudden there was this person, a Nazi sympathizer, we should go to Argentina. This is before the end of the war. So there was always a suspicion that Argentina, which was at that time during a military regime, was pro-Nazis. They weren't. Maybe the regime had some sympathies, but the country was never pro-Nazi. But who was the Secretary of State? Cordell Hull. I read some of those documents, too, quite a few of them. And you could see the suspicion always pointing. You can't trust those military because they are pro-Nazi. In a way, it was right, but the country was not pro-Nazi. So when Eichmann was discovered there, taken, the word was Argentina is the refuge for all the Nazis. Now, they had that distinction. A few of them went there, a few went to Brazil, a few went to Chile, but the most came to America. And some were invited, Von Braun and others,
Yeah.
because they had the know-how, and we needed the know-how here to fight the communists right after the war. But anyway, wherever you go, there are Nazis who have been received in this country as well. That I say with a little bit of, being a little bit on the defensive, because for a variety of reasons, every country absorbed some Nazis. That doesn't make a country a pro-Nazi country, because at the same time, they were trying to absorb some Jews, and they saved Jews. Even during the years of the Depression that preceded the war, it was difficult for most countries to open the gates when there were so many people without jobs. And the thought was that they're going to take a few jobs away from our people. Today we may think differently. I think, first of all, that immigrants bring jobs. They bring children, you have to build schools, you have to build houses, you have to employ people. You know, they stimulate the economy. Immigration usually does that as well. But the mentality in those days was the jobs are limited, we want to keep them for us. So Eichmann was captured in 1960 in the midst of the celebration of the Argentinian 6th Bicentennial, 150 years of their beginning of the revolt against Spain and independence. Big celebrations. Abba Eban came from Israel in his El Al plane, not his, but the only, I like to say this, the only time El Al flew to Argentina. El Al doesn't fly to South America. They fly to the States and to Europe and sometimes to bigger markets. So from Argentina, if you want to go to Israel, you fly to some place in Europe and then you change planes. That was the only time El Al flew in. He disembarked, he remained with his retinue for the festivities for a few days, but the plane left a day later with Eichmann in its belly. The Israeli agents spirited him out of Argentina, and it was illegal. But they did it for a good reason, because they did not want to try Eichmann in Buenos Aires. They would have missed a very good opportunity to talk about the Holocaust to the world and so on. And as I mentioned last night, Ben-Gurion announced to the Knesset, the following day we have caught a big fish, a big Nazi criminal, but I cannot tell you his name nor where he was caught. And immediately the news were all over the country. Eichmann was caught in Buenos Aires. So you can't keep a secret. But for those who were much younger in those days, it's 55 years ago, those were days in which people rarely spoke about the Holocaust in the 50s. It was too close. The survivors did not speak, even in Israel. The survivors were ashamed because they came from a position of weakness, and the new Sabra was stark, strong and suntan, and these people came as refugees. But the Eichmann trial stirred the Jewish world and the world at large, and then it became an open thing. And a lot of the survivors, for them it was a cathartic experience, because now they could talk about it. Anyway, in Argentina the consequences were recrudescence of anti-Semitism. The country had to break relations with Israel. the ambassador was declared persona non grata because, after all, Israel had done a no-no. How do you take a person out of the country, smuggle it, and then describe it as a great feat? But it was a democratic government in Argentina, and things calmed down very fast. They had to break relations, and they repaxed them. It was something that had to be done. The next year, as the trial took place, and news came every day about who was on the giving testifying at the trial, and there were long weeks and long months of the trial, and again some anti-Semitic attacks. And then the next year, when Eichmann was sentenced to death and executed, again, recrudescence of anti-Semitism. Not necessarily anti-Israel, but there were nationalist groups that rose in Argentina against Jews and against other more liberal tenets in the country. So there were some acts of violence, no pogroms, no big deals, but they all added up to something. And the community organized a strike to demonstrate against these anti-Semitic attempts and events, and they were very, very well endorsed by the population. The whole country, for a half a day, the afternoon of a weekday, closed in solidarity with the demands of the Jewish community. And it was in June or July of '62. I remember that very vividly myself. That was the Eichmann thing. There's a lot more to say about it, but I'll go to the last point, which is the two bombings in the early 90s. 92 against the Israeli embassy, totally destroyed. I think 27 or 28 people killed. And 2 years later, in 94, the Amia, the main edifice where a lot of Jewish institutions were headquartered, was blown out. Was blown out.
What's the name of the
JCC.
place? It's called the AMIA, AMIA, and it would be like the JCC and Federation kind of rolled into one.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So like a JCC.
Yes,
Okay.
it was a major institution of Ashkenazi Jewry.
What year was that?
1994.
1984?
94.
94, okay.
This was mainly a foreign event, or ideated by people in the Arab world or Middle Eastern nations. The Iranian embassy in Argentina was very much responsible as a conduit for the operation. The Hezbollah also, with local people as well, because foreigners cannot do something in a foreign country. They have to have a local connection that knows the ways and what have you. Of the 85 people killed, there were Jews, many Jews, who were working there, or some people were even, sadly enough, coming. That's a place where if there's a death in the family, you go to the Amia to make the arrangements for the funeral, because the Amia actually grew out of the Chevra Kadisha, the burial society in Argentina. So they control all the Ashkenazi cemeteries. So there were people making arrangements for a parent or a grandparent, and they were killed because they were at the wrong place at the wrong time. And then people in the street, Jews and non-Jews alike, that were killed because this was a car full of dynamite and all types of explosives that was run into the main door of the edifice and detonated, and the building crumbled down. And it was the largest terrorist act up to that day in the Western Hemisphere. Sadly, it was surpassed by 9/11 later on, a few years later, in America. This is an unresolved case, 21 years later. Justice moved slowly, and a lot of people were bribed by different interested parties involved, including Iranians, including people in the governments, covers up. It's too complicated to give a talk in 2 minutes about this. But to this date, it has not been resolved. A prosecutor who attempted was found dead 2 days before his testimony before the Congress in January of this year. This is Alberto Nisman. He had very good intentions, but he, according to his view, he had information that would put the president of the country in jeopardy, and also the foreign minister, who is Mr. Timmerman, a Jew. On the one hand, Jews are very visible. The two main positions in the current government are held by Jews: foreign minister and minister of economy. So, two pivotal aspects of the government are held by Jews, not necessarily beloved by the Jewish community, to the point that Mr. Timmerman, as the official foreign authority in the country, was about 2 years ago made arrangements with Iranian officials to make a deal, an understanding, in order to promote the exchange of goods between the two countries. And also going against the embargo of Iran that was put in place by the US and some European countries. They wanted to do what the United States didn't want. But Iran is not only a big enemy of Israel. Iran, in the Argentinian mind, should be the epitome of the enemy, because they were responsible for those bombings. And people want to forget. The families were scandalized, the families of the victims. Justice, how can you forget? Anyway, it's all in limbo. There are new elections coming up in Argentina next week. And we'll see what happens. But it will be more of the same, I think. And just to finish, I would say, don't forget that there is, I always quote one of my professors, Professor Salo Baron, a major Jewish historian who died about 25 years ago, the father of modern Jewish historians, I would say. He said, my position in writing about the history of my people, and he wrote a whole history in 18 volumes plus other essays as well, is that I'm opposed to the lachrymose view of Jewish history. Lachrymose from tears, Jewish history has enough sad events, but it's not all of it. There is a lot of creativity in between the Crusaders who attacked the Jews of Germany and France and so on. They didn't attack every shtetl at the same time. Sometimes this one got it, sometimes that one. In the meantime, Jewish life will continue to be creative and continue to be a source of pride and comfort for the individuals. So Argentine Jewry and its history has these two aspects: inclusion and exclusion, anti-Semitism, but also creativity, a lot of creativity. The Yiddish theater, the Yiddish press, and then in Spanish the same things, the synagogues, the culture, the summer camps, I mean, a variety of life. And it's an educated jury. People go to college, people converse about music, about art, about Israel, conflicting views and so on. But it's a live community. So we'll go upstairs.
So,